Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. The Bible tells one big story of redemption, and we want to spend 5 minutes every day journeying through the Bible from start to finish and exploring how all of it points to Jesus.
Hello, and welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and today we're jumping into Exodus 22 through 24. We begin in chapter 22. Moses is still on the top of Mount Sinai, hearing the laws from the great Yahweh. God continues to share with Moses his instructions for the Israelites. Out of his goodness, he builds on the 10 Commandments. If the 10 Commandments were bone, these next laws in chapter 22 and 23 are flesh building on top of them. He begins with laws about restitution. Restitution is a payment for what's been lost or injured. God covers exactly how to handle theft, the damage of crops, lost property, and breaches of trust. These laws require the guilty to pay more than what was stolen or damaged. Next, God expands upon the first 2 commandments. Don't have any other gods and don't worship idols. He tells the Israelites that sacrificing to other gods will end in destruction. God also instructs Moses on how his people should care for one another. They shouldn't take advantage of women. They should treat immigrants kindly. God again emphasizes on keeping the Sabbath. Each week, 6 days should be devoted to work, and the 7th to rest. Sabbath applied to their fields as well. For 6 years, the Israelites should use their fields, and on the 7th, they should let them be. And finally, God instructs the Israelites to honor him with 3 festivals each year. These festivals would be reminders throughout the year of God's provision. After God finished speaking the laws to Moses, he again reminded him that he would go with them. And if they would just keep his commandments, he would protect them from their enemies and make them a fruitful nation. Now it was Israel's turn to respond to the Lord's covenant, affirming their commitment to him. Moses wrote down the statutes of the Lord. He offered sacrifices early the next morning and communicated God's laws with the people. They agreed to keep all that God had commanded. Moses took the blood from his sacrifices and threw it upon the people to cleanse them of their sins. And then something amazing happened. Moses and the elders of Israel went on to Mount Sinai and caught a glimpse of God. They saw his feet upon sapphire stone, and God invited them to dine with them. That's right, the God that parted the sea allowed the Israelites to eat in his presence. A powerful display of fellowship between God and his people. God stayed on that mountain for 6 days in the form of fire and smoke. His glory could be felt everywhere. On the 7th day, God called Moses further up the mountain. Chapter 24 ends with Moses spending 40 days and 40 nights with Yahweh. These chapters have Jesus written all over them. God's presence was thick on Mount Sinai. There are not many places in the Old Testament where God revealed himself so visibly as he did in these chapters. They heard his voice. They saw his feet. They dined with him, and they felt his glory through fire that consumed the entire mountain. Sound familiar? Well, God became flesh through Jesus, experiencing what we experience. Jesus dined with us. Jesus felt hunger and he felt thirst. He felt sadness and joy and anger just like we do. Yet he didn't sin. And when Jesus died and rose again, those who trust in him gain not only his righteousness, but his spirit. This means that he is just as close to us today. We are never alone. We are never without access to the Father's instruction. His presence is just as thick with us today as it was with the Israelites in those chapters. Christ sent his Spirit to guide us. We have access to his mighty power at all times, if we would only remember to seek it. God builds on the 10 Commandments in chapters 22 and 23. God's instructions to the Israelites show his heart for the least fortunate in society. God protects the widows, children, immigrants, and the poor. And Jesus did too. In fact, Jesus' second greatest commandment was to love your neighbors as yourself. And Jesus did too. In fact, his second greatest commandment was to love your neighbor as yourself. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus extends the definition of neighbor to include the vulnerable and even our worst enemy. How are you currently reflecting the heart of God to your neighbor? Oftentimes, the modern culture views Christians as exclusive. They don't know the Jesus who ate with outcasts and befriended sinners. We have the opportunity to break the stereotype. Who in your life can you uplift this week? Who can you stand up for? These statutes of God show us his compassionate heart. It's time that we start showing that to the world.